If you are a fan of the strange, the dark, and the mysterious, delivered in a cinematic, true crime style, you are going to want to lock your doors and turn up the volume, because what you are about to hear is not a campfire story. It is a documented series of events surrounding one of the most baffling and terrifying search and rescue operations in American history. It is a story about the fragile veil between our reality and whatever breathes in the dark spaces of the world. Our story begins in the sprawling, rugged expanse of the North Cascades in Washington state. They call it the American Alps. It is an unforgiving landscape of jagged peaks, plunging valleys, and forests so dense that the canopy blocks out the sun even at high noon. It is beautiful, but it is brutally indifferent to human life. Elias Thorne knew this better than anyone. At 42 years old, Elias had spent 15 years as a lead coordinator for a specialized search and rescue (SAR) outfit. He was the guy you called when the local police, the volunteer hikers, and the helicopters came up empty. Elias was a stoic, deeply analytical man. He didn't believe in ghosts, he didn't believe in Bigfoot, and he certainly didn't believe in curses. He believed in topography, weather patterns, and the predictable psychology of a panicked human being. Elias used to say there are 3 types of lost. The first is the turnaround. Someone steps off the trail to relieve themselves, gets disoriented, and wanders in a circle. You usually find them within 12 hours, embarrassed but fine. The second is the runner. Panic sets in. Their adrenaline spikes and they start moving rapidly in a straight line, completely blind to the terrain, trying to force their way back to civilization. You find them battered, exhausted, sometimes injured, but alive. But the third type, Elias called them the taken. These are the cases where the breadcrumbs just stop. No tracks, no torn clothing, no dropped gear. The person simply ceases to exist, as if they were plucked directly off the face of the earth by an invisible hand. On the afternoon of October 14th, Elias received a call about a missing hiker. His name was Caleb Vance. Caleb was 19 years old, a sophomore at a nearby university, and an avid outdoorsman. He wasn't a novice who had wandered into the woods in sneakers and jeans. He was an experienced ridge runner, a hiker who preferred to forge his own paths along the high-altitude ridges. Caleb had set out on a solo, 3-day backpacking trip. When he failed to check in with his roommate by Tuesday evening, the authorities were notified. By Wednesday morning, Elias and his team had established an incident command post at the base of the Blackwood Ridge. The weather was rapidly deteriorating. A heavy, unseasonable Pacific storm was rolling in, dropping the temperature into the low 40s and blanketing the mountain in a freezing, suffocating rain. The initial search grid covered 10 square miles. For the first 2 days, Elias ran the operation by the book. He sent out hasty teams to check the main trails, deployed drones with thermal imaging to sweep the canopies, and brought in the tracking dogs. But by Friday, the situation had shifted from a rescue operation to a recovery mission. The freezing rain had washed away any potential tracks. The thermal drones were rendered useless by the thick, grey fog that had settled over the peaks. And then, there was the incident with the dogs. Dave, a veteran canine handler, had brought in his prize bloodhound, Buster. Buster had found lost children in ravines and dementia patients in swamps. But when Dave led Buster to the edge of Sector 4, a deep, bowl-shaped valley known to locals as the Whisper Bowl, the dog completely broke down. Elias was there when it happened. Buster didn't just lose the scent, he actively recoiled. The massive dog planted his paws into the mud, tucked his tail firmly between his legs, and began to emit a low, sustained whine that sounded almost human. When Dave tried to coax him forward, Buster snapped at him, something the dog had never done in his 8 years of service, and desperately strained against his leash to pull back toward the parking lot. "He won't go in, Elias," Dave had said, his face pale beneath his rain hood. "I've never seen him like this. It's like he's looking at a brick wall of pure predator." Elias stared down into the Whisper Bowl. The valley was an anomaly of the Cascades. Because of the sheer rock walls surrounding it on 3 sides, the wind would whip through the valley, creating strange acoustic echoes. Logging companies in the 1920s had tried to clear it, but after a string of gruesome, unexplained accidents, the camps were abandoned. The trees down there were old-growth redwoods and Douglas firs, ancient and towering, their trunks choked with a pale, grayish lichen that looked like decaying skin. Elias didn't like the Whisper Bowl, but he was a professional. He knew that lost hikers often follow the path of least resistance, and gravity dictates that the path of least resistance is almost always down. If Caleb had fallen or gotten severely disoriented, he would have ended up at the bottom of that valley. "All right," Elias said, adjusting the straps of his heavy tactical pack. "I'll sweep the valley, keep the teams on the ridge. If I don't radio in by nightfall, pull everyone back." It was a breach of protocol to go in alone, but resources were stretched thin, and Elias knew the terrain better than anyone. He checked his sidearm, tested his radio, and began the steep, treacherous descent into Sector 4. The transition was immediate and deeply unsettling. As Elias descended into the tree line of the Whisper Bowl, the temperature plummeted by at least 15 degrees. But worse than the cold was the atmosphere. The heavy rain that had been battering him on the ridge was suddenly caught in the massive, interlocking canopy above. Instead of a downpour, the forest floor was trapped in a perpetual, misty twilight, with giant drops of water falling in rhythmic, heavy thuds from the branches hundreds of feet in the air. And then, the Oz factor hit. When you spend thousands of hours in the wilderness, you learn its symphony. You hear the crunch of underbrush, the chatter of birds, the distant rush of a creek, the swaying of timber. But as Elias reached the valley floor, the symphony violently stopped. Total, suffocating silence. The wind ceased. The birds were gone. Even the sound of his own heavy boots squelching in the mud seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened into a damp sponge, absorbing every frequency. Elias paused, his heart rate elevated. The hairs on the back of his neck stood at attention. A deep instinctual dread washed over him, the kind of dread our ancestors felt when they realized the saber-toothed tiger was no longer in front of them, but behind them. Just the acoustics of the valley, Elias told himself. Keep moving. He activated his radio. "Command, this is Thorne. I'm on the valley floor, commencing grid sweep, moving north-northwest. Over." He waited for the dispatcher's acknowledgement. Instead, his radio spat out a burst of heavy, aggressive static, followed by absolute dead air. He checked the display. No signal. He was completely cut off. Elias pushed forward, his eyes scanning the dense, fern-covered ground. He walked for 2 hours, methodically clearing the grid. The silence was maddening. It felt as though the twisted, lichen-covered trees were leaning in, observing him. At 3:15 p.m., he found it. Tucked neatly at the base of a hollowed-out cedar tree was a bright orange object. Elias drew closer, his pulse quickening. It was an Osprey brand hiking backpack, Caleb's backpack. Elias immediately went into forensic mode. He didn't touch the bag right away. He scanned the perimeter. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, no erratic footprints in the mud. The backpack hadn't been dropped in a panic. It had been taken off, carefully zipped shut, and placed deliberately against the tree. He knelt down and opened the top flap. The contents were terrifyingly normal. Rations, a portable stove, a sleeping bag, a water filtration system. A hiker does not abandon their lifeline in the deep woods unless they are experiencing profound hypothermia and paradoxical undressing, or unless something forces them to leave it. Tucked inside the front mesh pocket was a digital point-and-shoot camera. Elias pulled it out. It was a sturdy, weatherproof model. He pressed the power button. Miraculously, the battery icon glowed green. There were 42 photos on the SD card. Elias began to scroll through them, hoping to find a clue as to which direction Caleb had gone. What he saw on that tiny LCD screen would fundamentally break his understanding of reality. Photo 1 to 15, normal hiking shots. Caleb smiling at the trailhead. Panoramas of the ridge. A selfie with the setting sun. Photo 16 to 25, taken the next day. The weather is worse. Caleb looks tired. He's taking photos of unusual rock formations. Photo 26, taken at dusk. The flash is on. It's a shot of Caleb's campsite, but in the extreme upper right corner, just at the edge of the flash's reach, there is a physical distortion. It looks like a shadow, but it's completely wrong. It's too tall, too thin, perfectly blending with the vertical lines of the pine trees. Photo 30, Caleb's face, taking up the whole frame. He isn't smiling. His eyes are wide, bloodshot, dilated with pure terror. He is staring just past the camera lens. Photo 35, pitch black, just the flash illuminating the deep woods. But standing between two trees, about 50 feet away, are two impossibly long, pale legs. There is no torso, no waist, just smooth, bark-like skin stretching up into the dark canopy, anatomically incorrect, mimicking the shape of tree trunks. Elias's breath caught in his throat. His rational mind scrambled for an excuse. A trick of the light, a double exposure, a glitch in the digital sensor. He hit the next button. File 42 wasn't a photo, it was a video file. Elias pressed play. The audio hissed through the camera's tiny, tinny speaker, but in the dead silence of the valley, it sounded like a megaphone. The video is dark. The camera has been placed on the ground, looking up at Caleb. Caleb is huddled by a dying fire, shivering uncontrollably. He is not wearing his jacket. He looks directly into the lens. "It won't stop copying me," Caleb whispers, his voice cracking with exhaustion and horror. It doesn't understand what it's saying. It wears the voices. "It's been walking around my tent for hours." In the video, Caleb pauses. From the darkness outside the camera's view, a voice echoes through the woods. "It won't stop copying me." It was Caleb's exact voice. The exact same inflection, the exact same pitch, but entirely devoid of human emotion. It was like a recording played out of a broken speaker. In the video, Caleb covers his ears and squeezes his eyes shut. The video abruptly cuts out. Elias stared at the black screen, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked up from the camera. The mist had thickened. The light was dying. It was 4 p.m., but in the valley, night was falling fast. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. "Command, this is Thorne. I'm on the valley floor. Commencing grid sweep. Moving north-northwest. Over." Elias froze. The blood turned to ice in his veins. The voice had come from the trees, roughly 100 yards to his left. It was his voice, the exact radio transmission he had made 2 hours ago. Every pause, every breath, replicated with terrifying precision. Elias dropped the camera. He unholstered his Glock 19, gripping it with both hands, his eyes darting through the impenetrable grey fog. "Who's out there?" Elias roared, his tactical training briefly overriding his terror. From the dense brush, a different voice called out. It was a woman's voice, soft, agonizingly familiar. "Elias, honey, did you leave the back door open?" Elias stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the roots of the cedar tree. It was his mother's voice, his mother, who had passed away from cancer 8 years ago in a hospital bed 3 states away. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just mimicking what it heard. It was pulling things from inside his head. It was hunting him psychologically. "Elias, help me. My leg is broken." This time, it was Caleb's voice. The sounds were coming from different directions. First the left, then the right, then directly above him. The entity was moving with impossible speed, circling him, tightening the noose. Elias didn't run wildly. He knew that was a death sentence. He executed a tactical retreat, moving swiftly backward, keeping his gun raised, scanning his six. He needed high ground. He needed a defensible position. As he pushed through a thick cluster of thorny underbrush, he stumbled into a small, unnatural clearing. Sitting in the dead center of the clearing was something that defied all logic. It was an old, wooden structure, but it wasn't a pioneer cabin or an old logging facility. It looked like a modern 2-story suburban house, painted a faded colonial blue, complete with a shingled roof, a front porch, and glass windows. But it was entirely swallowed by the forest. Massive tree roots burst through the floorboards. The roof was caved in by a fallen fir. It looked as though someone had picked up a house from a 1990s cul-de-sac and dropped it directly into the most inaccessible part of the wilderness. Elias didn't care about the impossibility of it. He only saw shelter. He sprinted up the rotting porch steps, kicked the front door open, and threw himself inside, slamming the heavy wooden door shut behind him. He engaged the deadbolt, though the lock was rusted and brittle. Inside, the air smelled intensely of ozone, decaying leaves, and copper. Elias flicked on his heavy-duty maglite. The beam cut through the gloom. The interior of the house was absurd. There was a floral sofa, a smashed television set, and a staircase leading up into the darkness. But the walls were covered in deep, savage gouges, claw marks that tore through the drywall and bit deep into the structural studs. And scattered across the floor, completely defying explanation, were dozens of rusted animal traps, old climbing carabiners, torn scraps of flannel, and a rusted, blood-stained search and rescue badge from 1983. This wasn't just a house. It was a trap, a trophy room for whatever ruled the Whisper Bowl. Elias backed into the corner of the living room, leveling his flashlight and his sidearm at the front door. He controlled his breathing. Inhale for 4. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. Outside, the heavy thud of the rain stopped. The Oz factor had returned. Then Elias heard it. Heavy, deliberate footsteps on the wooden planks of the front porch. Thud, creak, thud, creak. The footsteps didn't sound like a man. They sounded too heavy, the spacing between the steps too wide. The handle of the front door slowly turned, the deadbolt held. Then, a voice came through the thick wood of the door. It was Elias's own voice, but it was devoid of its usual calm. It was a frantic, terrified scream. Command! Oh God, command! It's looking at me. It's wearing his face. Elias felt his sanity fracturing. He had never screamed those words. The entity wasn't repeating something he had said. It was broadcasting his future. It was showing him what he was about to do. The front door suddenly buckled inward under an unimaginable, percussive force. The rusted deadbolt snapped like a twig. The door flew open, slamming against the interior wall with a deafening crash. Elias raised his gun, his flashlight illuminating the doorway. Standing in the threshold was a nightmare born of the deep woods. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, forcing it to stoop underneath the doorframe. Its body was sickeningly elongated, the limbs too long for its torso, giving it the proportions of a daddy longlegs spider. The skin was heavily textured, pale grey and deeply cracked, mimicking the exact texture of the dead lichen on the trees. It wore clothes, scraps of Caleb's jacket, shredded and hanging off its massive shoulders. But the face, it didn't have a human face. Where a nose and eyes should have been, there was only a smooth, pale expanse of flesh. At the bottom of the face was a vertical slit, lined with row upon row of jagged, translucent teeth, like shards of shattered glass. As Elias aimed his flashlight at it, the vertical mouth opened, and it emitted a deafening, metallic shriek, the exact sound of Elias's radio static, amplified to 100 decibels. Survival instinct, honed by decades in the harshest environments on Earth, kicked in. Elias didn't freeze. He didn't scream. He squeezed the trigger. Bang, bang, bang. 3 rounds of 9mm hollow points tore into the center mass of the entity. The creature didn't bleed red. Black, viscous fluid erupted from the wounds. The entity staggered backward, letting out a horrific, multi-layered screech that sounded like a dozen human voices screaming in agony all at once. Elias knew the gun wouldn't kill it. He just needed an opening. He didn't run out the front door. He turned, sprinted across the living room, and threw his entire body weight through the glass of the back window. The window shattered. Elias tumbled out into the mud, the jagged glass tearing through his Gore-Tex jacket and slicing deep into his shoulder and cheek. He hit the ground rolling, scrambled to his feet, and ran. He didn't care about navigation. He didn't care about stealth. He ran with the reckless, blind terror of prey. He hit the dense underbrush, branches whipping his face, thorns tearing at his clothes. Behind him, he heard the house splintering. The entity was coming. The chase through the whisper bowl was a blur of adrenaline and sensory overload. Elias ran until his lungs burned with the taste of copper, until his legs felt like lead. Every time he felt he had gained distance, he would hear a heavy crash in the canopy above him, or a mocking, breathless whisper right next to his ear. It's looking at me. It's wearing his face. It was playing with him, herding him. Elias's foot caught on a massive, slick root. He pitched forward, tumbling violently down a steep embankment. He crashed through a cluster of ferns and slammed hard against a rock face. Searing pain shot up his leg. He had twisted his ankle badly. He dragged himself into a narrow crevice between 2 massive boulders, pulling his dark jacket tight, burying his face in the mud, trying to make himself as small as possible. He shut off his flashlight. He slowed his breathing, though his heart felt like it was going to beat out of his chest. In the pitch black, he listened. For 10 agonizing minutes, there was nothing. Then, a soft rustle in the leaves directly above the boulders. A low, wet sound, like something smelling the air. Elias clamped his hand over his mouth. Tears mingled with the blood on his face. Then, a voice echoed through the valley. It wasn't Elias's voice. It wasn't Caleb's. It was the voice of a little girl. "Hello? Is anyone there? I'm lost." The footsteps moved away. Thud, creak, thud, fading into the depths of the forest. Elias didn't move for 6 hours. He stayed wedged in the rocks until the first grey light of dawn broke through the dense canopy. When he finally emerged, he was a broken man. He limped for 14 miles, guided only by the moss on the trees and his sheer will to survive. By the time he breached the tree line and stumbled onto a remote logging road, he was hypothermic, severely dehydrated, and suffering from massive blood loss. A passing timber truck found him wandering the yellow line of the asphalt, his hair plastered to his forehead with dried blood, his eyes locked in a 1,000-yard stare. Elias Thorne was airlifted to a hospital in Seattle. He spent 3 weeks in the ICU. The official report filed by the Search and Rescue Command stated that Elias had suffered a traumatic wilderness psychosis combined with a bear attack. It is the easiest lie we tell ourselves to keep the darkness at bay. The search for Caleb Vance was officially called off 2 days after Elias was found. A massive mudslide, triggered by the torrential rains, swept through Sector 4, completely burying the Whisper Bowl under thousands of tons of rock and earth. The unnatural house, the camera, and whatever stalked the shadows of those woods were buried forever. Elias resigned from search and rescue the day he was discharged from the hospital. He moved to an apartment in the city, far away from any tree line. He refuses to go to parks. He refuses to leave his windows open, because Elias knows the truth. The wilderness does not forget. Caleb Vance's body was never recovered, but Elias's torment didn't end on that mountain. Every few months, usually around 3 in the morning, Elias's phone will ring. The caller ID always says unknown. When he answers, there is no heavy breathing. There is no static. There is only the profound, suffocating silence of the deep woods, the Oz factor. And then, just before the line goes dead, a voice whispers through the speaker, a voice that sounds exactly like Elias, echoing with a quiet, emotionless promise. I'm wearing his face.